Read the word green out loud. Now say the ink color when the word green is printed in red. If you just froze or stuttered, your brain lost a fight against a reflex it could not suppress, and the word won almost every time. This is the color word trap, and it is one of the oldest documented glitches in experimental psychology. But it is not just a lab trick. The same reflex hijacks your attention on every street, on every screen, and in every conversation you have ever had with a bright yellow subtitle. The story of why that happens begins in a German laboratory in the 1880s, winds through a Tennessee classroom in 1935, and ends inside the most overworked tissue in your skull. The first person to notice that something was wrong was an American psychologist named James McKeen Cattell. In 1886, Cattell was working in Wilhelm Wundt's Leipzig laboratory, the birthplace of modern experimental psychology. He was timing responses with equipment that was, by modern standards, barely more than a pendulum. He showed people a series of words and a series of colored objects and measured how long it took to name each. The results were odd. Reading a word aloud was much faster than naming an object or a color. Cattell reasoned that reading had become a habit of association, so overlearned that the word seemed to speak itself. He estimated that the connection between a printed word and its pronunciation was so strong that it could not be interrupted. He did not know the half of it. Cattell could not explain why the interference went one way, why words break through to your voice, but colors do not hijack your speech. The puzzle sat mostly untouched for half a century. Psychologists knew reading was fast and automatic, but they had no clean way to demonstrate the fight between an automatic process and a deliberate one. They needed a test where the two systems collided head-on. Enter John Ridley Stroop, a doctoral student at George Peabody College in Nashville. Stroop was not a famous researcher. He was a minister who spent his working life teaching at a small college. But in 1935, at the age of 38, he published a paper that became one of the most cited in all of psychology. Its title was Dry and Honest: Studies of Interference in Serial Verbal Reactions. The effect would eventually carry his name, though he never asked for it. The paper appeared in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, and it described a trap so simple that other researchers could rebuild it in an afternoon. Stroop built 2 cards. Each card had 110 test items arranged in 10 columns of 11. The first card had color words printed in a matching ink. The second card was identical, except the ink did not match the word. The word green was printed in red, the word blue in yellow, and so on. Stroop asked people to do 2 tasks. First, read the words out loud. Second, name the colors of the ink while ignoring the word entirely. The results were something he had to measure twice to believe. Reading the words was barely slowed by the mismatched ink. The interference was real but tiny. Naming the ink was a disaster. The mismatched card took people roughly 60% longer than the matching card. People stalled, slipped, produced the wrong word, and knew it was wrong before the sound fully escaped. The word was winning, in real time, against the person's own explicit intention. Stroop called the slowdown interference. He offered a simple explanation. When you read the word green, the response green is loaded and ready long before you have finished identifying the ink color. The verbal response blocks the color response. For decades, the phenomenon stayed in a quiet corner of psychology. It did not even have a standard name until cognitive psychologists in the 1960s, working mainly on attention, started calling it the Stroop effect. The 1935 paper became a foundation stone. What made it survive, and eventually grow into thousands of follow-up studies, was not the name. It was the fact that Stroop had built an instrument that could measure the invisible cost of automaticity. That instrument turned out to be a window into how the brain controls itself. So why does the word win? The answer is redundancy followed by suppression. Reading is overlearned. Most adults have spent thousands of hours decoding letters into sounds and meanings. Every exposure strengthens the connection. By adulthood, the moment your visual system recognizes a word, the meaning is activated automatically. You cannot turn it off. Naming a color, by contrast, requires a deliberate act. You have to isolate the wavelength, suppress the object label that goes with it, and produce a color name that is lower on the priority ladder. The two processes race. The word usually arrives first, and the brain must spend resources inhibiting it. That cost shows up in the anterior cingulate cortex and the prefrontal cortex, regions responsible for detecting conflict and enforcing control. The stutter you felt at the start is the sound of your prefrontal cortex catching up to a reflex that has already fired. The Stroop effect was eventually brought into the brain scanner. Studies using functional magnetic resonance imaging show a reliable surge of activity in the anterior cingulate and the prefrontal cortex when people face an incongruent trial. This pattern has been replicated hundreds of times. The delay you experience is not a quirk of one card or one language. It is a core feature of the cognitive control system. In fact, the effect is strong enough that it is used as a clinical tool. The test is still one of the most widely used instruments in neuropsychology, a measure of attention and inhibitory control. It can identify damage to the frontal lobes, and it is sensitive to changes in mood, aging, and even sleep deprivation. But there is a limit to its universality, and that limit is reading itself. Here is the twist that pins down the whole mechanism. If the words win because reading is an overlearned reflex, then people who cannot read should not experience the trap. That is exactly what the data show. Children before reading instruction show little or no Stroop interference. Adults who are illiterate, tested on the same task, show a much smaller slowdown. The moment someone learns to read, the effect appears. It tracks reading skill during childhood, growing stronger as the reflex deepens. And it shows up in every writing system studied, from English to Hebrew to Chinese. In bilinguals, the effect is stronger in the dominant language, the one with more practice behind it. This is the strongest proof that the enemy you are fighting at the stop sign is not the ink. It is the lifetime of reading practice inscribed in your neural circuitry. The same logic was pushed further in the 1980s when researchers built a variation called the emotional Stroop. In this version, the words are not color names. They are emotionally charged words like spider, pain, or death. The task stays the same. Name the ink color. People with specific fears are slower to name the color of threat-related words. A person with a spider phobia will stall on the word spider, even if the ink is green. A person with anxiety will stall on threatening words embedded in a list. This is not the same mechanism as the original effect. The word is not competing with the ink directly. Instead, the emotional content consumes attention, leaving fewer resources for the color naming task. What the emotional Stroop shows is that the reading reflex has a second gate. The moment a word is recognized, its emotional weight is loaded into your attention before you can block it. You cannot choose which words grab you. The selection happens behind the curtain. Now bring the trap outside the laboratory. Walk down any street and you are surrounded by text. Billboards, neon signs, stickers on cars, logos on clothing, letters printed on delivery trucks. You do not decide to read them. By the time you are aware of the word, its meaning has already arrived. This is why a flashing sign says sale, and your attention is captured even when you had no interest in a sale. This is why a caption bar at the bottom of a screen pulls your eyes away from the action. This is also why a notification is so dangerous. The phone buzzes, you glance, and the text of the notification is read before you have formed a single thought about it. The reading reflex has hijacked the goal system faster than the slow, deliberate you can intervene. That involuntary transfer of attention is the Stroop effect, playing out in the wild, thousands of times a day. There is a strange consequence of this reflex for everyone who designs messages. If reading cannot be stopped, then a warning sign does not need to be pretty. It needs to be fast. The classic example is the stop sign. The shape and the color are processed as a symbol, but the word stop is also read as a letter string, and the reading is mandatory. In the United States, the stop sign was standardized in the 1920s, decades before the Stroop effect was named, yet the principle is identical. The most effective warnings put the critical word in the center of a high-contrast shape, because they are designed for a brain that has no off switch for letters. The implications run the other direction too. A poster with text on a busy background forces your system to waste effort just to suppress the clutter. The design of the message is a design of the interference, and the interference is not optional. The story of the Stroop effect is not only about the word winning, it is also about what happens when the word loses. People with damage to the frontal lobes often show a dramatic pattern on the Stroop test. They make the interference errors that most of us suppress, saying green when the ink is red, even when they know it is wrong. The prefrontal cortex is the brake, and when the brake is damaged, the reflex races openly. People with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder tend to show steeper slowdowns on the test, particularly under time pressure. And the task is so sensitive that it is used to track recovery after traumatic brain injury. So the same test measures two things: the strength of an automatic habit and the power of the system that suppresses it. Every time you name the color correctly, you are not just reading well. You are winning a tiny war against your own most practiced skill. Which raises a deeper question. Why should a system designed for recognizing faces and objects snap so easily into something that reads letters? Reading did not exist long enough for evolution to build a dedicated module. Writing is about 5,000 years old, a blink in evolutionary time. What happens instead is neuron recycling. The visual word form area, a patch of cortex in the fusiform gyrus, evolved to recognize objects, faces, and shapes. When you learn to read, that patch is co-opted for letters. The brain does not invent a new circuit, it steals one. That is why reading feels as immediate as seeing a face. The neurons treat the letter string as an object, and objects are recognized automatically by one quick circuit with no need for attention. So the reason the word wins in the color word trap is that your visual system genuinely cannot tell the difference between a word and a face. Both are processed as something that must be identified at once. What you see literally gets its meaning before you. So go back to the first test. The freeze you felt when the word green was printed in red was not a sign of weakness. It was a measurable collision between a reflex built from years of reading and a deliberate act you asked your brain to perform. The word almost always wins because it has thousands of hours of practice on its side. But the fact that you can sometimes say red at all is the more remarkable fact. It means your frontal lobes are doing exactly what they evolved to do, noticing the conflict and overriding the reflex. The color word trap is a rare moment in which you can feel your own cognitive control working in real time. The stutter is the sound of the brain negotiating with itself, and every time it happens, you are witnessing the deepest lesson of the Stroop effect. Your attention is a battlefield, and the words around you have already fired their first shot.